Hello and welcome to my session 10 Things to Think About When Developing an Application for Microsoft Teams. My name is Jannik Reekmans and day to day I work as a cloud solution architect in Belgium with a broad focus on the Microsoft Cloud. I'm also an Office Development MVP and there I'm mainly active in the space of SharePoint and Microsoft Teams development. You can find my Twitter handle and my blog URL on the slides. Feel free to reach out. From my blog, you can click through to my LinkedIn. Feel free to connect and send all of the questions my way like that. First of all, let's check out the topics of today. So we'll get a brief introduction in what it is to develop a Teams application, and then we'll look at the 10 things to think about when developing an app for Teams. And at the end, we'll do a small wrap-up. So, you want to build an app. There are four ways of building an application in Microsoft Teams. First of all are the ready-made solutions. Those are made available in the Teams store. You can just go into the Teams store in your Teams client, select an application, install it, and start using it. Second category of applications in Microsoft Teams are those applications that you build with the Power Platform. So you can automate tasks and low-code applications by using Power Automate or Power Apps and even sometimes Power Virtual Agents if you need to build a bot. One step higher in the development, or in the development complexity, there are the reference solutions. Those are out-of-the-box templates that are made available by Microsoft and the community on GitHub. They come with support through the GitHub issues list, and you can use them as is, as inspiration for your own applications, or you can use them as a building block or a stepping stone so you can extend them with the additional functionality that you require. And then of course, the last one are the custom built applications. Everything you do from scratch. Now, for today, of course, the first one, second one, and third one aren't that interesting for this presentation because we want to build our own custom built applications and want to figure out what we need to decide before we start building. So let's get to it. First of all, figure out what problem you're trying to solve. Who do you want to help? What do they do, or those people do? And why do they need your application? When do they need your application? Where do they need it? So you have to know who your audience is. You want to build something to ease their lives or improve their workflow. So you really need to understand who will be using your application and when will they need it. Why do they need it? Does it optimize their flow? Does it ease their work? Does it make everything quicker? And what is their exact job? So you can automate it or you can create the application that the users really need. And once you know that, start by describing the goal of your application. Keep it simple and concise, goal-oriented, specific and realistic. Make sure that you focus on the story first and don't think about solutions yet. So you just start with writing down everything that your application will do, what will be your short-term and long-term goal with that application, and who will you create it for. What do those people do, and what will you be solving or why will you be making their lives easier? And that's the why of your application. You always need the purpose of your application first, so you can understand and work towards that goal of achieving more inside the Teams client. And once you know what you're going to build or what your goal is, you have to take a good hard look at your scenario and ask yourself if it warrants custom development. Is it an actual problem? Because you really need to focus on solving real-world problems for your users. And you need to select use cases with broad impact, those that solve everyday problems encountered by many users. So you can target the high return on investment solutions. So we as developers tend to make up problems just to have an excuse of building stuff. So when you do this in an enterprise environment, this is not going to be a good return on investment. Same goes for the usage time and the number of users. Preferably, you pick the use cases where people will be using your application a lot, by many users, so that the investment you make in building the application is for a broad audience and will resolve a lot of the usage time. Now that you know your application and you really know that you want to build it or you need to build it because it solves a real world problem, you have to go look at all of the team's extensibility scenarios or extensibility options and pick the app capability that fits your scenario best. So before you can make that decision, of course, you need to understand and know what the capabilities are. So let's see. First of all, there are the tabs. Tabs is when your app needs a large area to present information to users. So a tab is a great place to show a list of work items or a dashboard to your users. And they can use it to chat about content in your tab as a threaded conversation inside Teams. So a tab is a canvas to host your UI. It's a big place, so you can put a lot of information in there. You can also use a bot. They're very popular right now, so they're basically a smart chat for your users. So you can drive engagement in a channel or in a one-on-one conversation. They can handle question and answer scenarios or automation scenarios. And a bot also includes or can include a tab as well. So when you're chatting with your bot, you can have a tab to browse complementary scenarios. Then there are also the messaging extensions. So messaging extensions are used to share rich cards. So with a messaging extension, your users can share an actionable card that grabs people's attention. And they can get simple jobs done without leaving the conversation. So this is about, for example, sending a link to GitHub, which will render an interactive card showing the information that's linked to. But it can also be used to send out information, the message itself, to your web service so it can be processed and an answer can be returned. And those are called messaging actions. They are used to interpret chat. You use them to send the text of the message to your web service, and your web service will respond with a task module or an interactive card with additional information. Talking about task modules. Task modules are a dialog for tasks. So they let you open a dialog from bots or cards where your users can enter information in a little form, do a lookup or keep one-on-one interaction out of a channel. You open this dialog and all of that information is captured and can be sent to your application for processing. And last but not least, we've got the notifications. With notifications, you can do add mentions or toast pop-ups to call attention for your users on the specific message or important actions. This will also put a notification item into the activity feed of the Teams client. These are the capabilities. Now, you can also group them in a different way, like Canvas-based and message-based. Canvas-based apps are like the Microsoft Teams tabs. These Canvas-based applications have a big UI to show. Now the other extensibilities are message-based. They can either be triggered on a message or they create a message inside of your Teams client. And then there also are newly announced at Ignite previous month, the meetings-based extensibility options. And this is a capability recently announced where you can create an application that integrates with a meeting. It starts with a pre-meeting tab, so when you create in your calendar a new meeting, you can already add a custom application in there to configure or prepare the information that needs to be shared through or during the actual meeting. And during that meeting, you have the ability to show notifications in meeting notifications, but also in meeting tabs. So that information that you configured upfront before the meeting can now be pushed out step by step or whatever your application functionality is to your end users. And at the end, the tab will still exist after the meeting in the post-meeting tab and potentially collect all the information that has been shown throughout the meeting. So these are rich extensibility capabilities, and depending on your scenario, you have to pick one or multiple to create your application and inject it inside the Teams client at the right place. It's not only the capability you have to choose, but also the scope you have to choose. Because a Teams app comes in different scopes. So the first scope is a team scope. The team scope is supposed to show information that's relevant to a group of people. So this is where your application will be in a team scope when it's loaded inside a Teams channel or in a one-on-one or group chat. This is for multiple people. So when your application is in the team scope, it should show information relevant to the people that are in that same scope as well. Now a Teams application can also go into the personal scope. This is when we talk about personal apps. Personal apps are pinned in the left-hand rail of your application, and they are supposed to surface information that's only relevant to you as an end user, to the one person that opens up or interacts with your application. Or it can also be a one-on-one bot, because that bot only interacts with one user at a time. It's supposed to surface information relevant to that specific user. One of the best examples here is the Microsoft Planner app, or to be renamed the Tasks app. In the team scope, it shows you the task for that specific team or for that group of people, but in personal scope, it only shows the tasks that are assigned to you. When we check, you see that in the team scope, you can have tabs, messaging extensions, messaging actions, and bots. And in personal scope, you can have the same thing with the notable extension of also the personal app. A tab and a personal app are built in more or less the same way from a technical standpoint. Only a tab is shown, for example, with a one-on-one bot, but also in a one-on-one group or in a one-on-one conversation. A personal app itself shows or uses the whole canvas of the Teams client and is pinned in the left-hand rail. Now that you know what you want to build and know how you're going to build it with which capabilities and in what place or what extensibility model and what scope, you have to pick a development framework for your application. Looking at the development framework options, they differ a little bit depending on the extensibility point that you choose or chose. So if you go for developing a bot, you can use the bot framework v4, and there you can choose C#, JavaScript, or Python, because those SDKs are made available for developing bots. Of course, if you want to build a bot using the Power Platform, you can always use Power Virtual Agents. When developing or creating messaging extensions are also built on top of the bot framework. So with the bot framework v4, you can still use C# and JavaScript for creating those messaging extensions. You cannot use Python because that's not supported. Although it's available in the bot framework, the messaging extensions extensibility points are not made available in the Python SDK. Moving on to the building custom tab. A custom tab is basically, in essence, an iframe showing a web application. So you can use any web development framework to create that Microsoft Teams tab. We see in the Microsoft world that Node.js and React are quite popular to create those Microsoft Teams tabs, but also C# with ASP.NET Core MVC or just the full-blown C# MVC, ASP.NET MVC framework. And for those that come from SharePoint framework or SharePoint development, you can also use the SharePoint framework, the new extensibility model for SharePoint Online, to build your Microsoft Teams tabs in the personal or in the group scope. For messaging extensions, there's no equivalent in the Power Platform, but of course for a Teams tab, you can also use Power Apps to create a Power App that you can embed as a Teams tab in the team scope or in the personal scope. You've got a backend, you chose your development framework, and now you have to pick a UX framework for your application. So what do you want to do there, or how do you approach this? First of all, there are the adaptive cards. Because the adaptive cards are a declarative UI. It's basically a JSON object that describes what needs to be shown on the screen, but not how it's layouted, or, well, what's the styling. Because adaptive cards are a JSON object, it's up to the hosting application to style it. As a result, the specific cards that get rendered get a UI that's or has a native look and feel for the hosting application. You can see on the left-hand side 5 examples of adaptive cards. Those 5 are the same JSON object, but they render differently depending on the hosting application. You can see that it's currently supported by Skype and Android already, but also iOS, Microsoft Teams, and the native notifications in Windows 10 also support adaptive cards. Adaptive cards itself are cross-platform supported, so you can use it on those multiple platforms, and even third-party applications are embedding this capability. And one of the major advantages is that it's automatically styled. You just declare what needs to be on the screen, and the application will render the result. And this way, your information will be rendered like it belongs to Microsoft Teams, for example. Adaptive cards are supported in messaging extensions, in bots, and in connectors. So you can use all 3 of them to put out an adaptive card for your end users. But what when you want to create your full-blown Teams tab? So what about a UX framework for a Teams tab? Well, a tab is just a website, so you can use whatever framework you want. But then my application doesn't look like the first-party apps, and I really need to make them look like they belong in the Teams client. So, lucky you, with a bit of sarcasm, Microsoft has a very consistent UX framework story. And it's called Fluent UI. Well, it's called now Fluent UI. Fluent UI is a collection of UX frameworks for creating beautiful cross-platform applications that share code, design, and interaction behavior. And Fluent UI is available for web, Windows, iOS, Android, macOS, and is cross-platform through React Native. Now, looking at Fluent UI, one of the downsides of Fluent UI is, although it says that it's a cross-platform application that share code and design and interaction behaviors, the SDKs or the packages for the different platforms aren't the same. So controls that exist for the web might not exist for Windows or for Android. So it's not always easy to build the same consistent UI experience. For us, when developing an application for Microsoft Teams, only the web components are relevant. When you look at the web components, the package now is called @fluentui/React and currently has version v7.x.x, somewhere a version number with v7. But it was previously known as Office UI Fabric React. So if you used to use Office UI Fabric React with, for example, your SharePoint development or some other development because you liked the framework, it's still the same. So with version 7, @fluentui React is just an export of the Office UI Fabric React. Nothing more, nothing less. It has a great set of controls and it has the best support available, but they still don't look like they belong in Microsoft Teams because they took or take the styling of the rest of Office 365, but Microsoft Teams has a little bit more distinct look and feel that doesn't really fit in the rest of Office 365. So what can you do when your application really needs to look like Microsoft Teams itself? You can take a look at the Microsoft Teams UI control library, also known as MS Teams UI Components React if you look it up at the NPM repository. These provide some specific controls for Microsoft Teams. And these controls are still available both on NPM, and you can look at them and interact with them in the App Studio. So you can open the Teams App Studio in your Teams client and see what's included in this Microsoft Teams UI control library. Too bad that it's deprecated. There's no work done to improve these controls, and no one is really using them. There's no reason that they still exist in App Studio, but they do, which makes it confusing for starting developers because they might take a dependency on this control library while it's really deprecated and not in use anymore. So what can you do? Well, you can use Fluent UI. Now, Fluent UI again, um, it used to be known, or it's also known as @FluentUI /React Nordstar, and it has a version number of 0 at the moment. It used to be known @FluentUI React v0, but that became too confusing with the v7. That's also out, and it really in the beginning was known as Stardust UI. And the goal of Stardust UI was to be a themable control library. Although it went through 2 renames and is currently under the Fluent UI umbrella or brand umbrella, the Nordstar version 0 is still the official library for Teams application development. So what's the Fluent UI endgame? The idea is to converge Stardust, Nordstar, and Fabric Fluent UI into one package. It will pull concepts of Nordstar into Fluent UI. So it will take all of the good things that the Teams team created when they started their Nordstar UI library or their Stardust UI library, and they will take those concepts into Fluent UI to create a better UI framework or UX framework for everybody. And this will happen iteratively because their end goal is to unify all of these capabilities. So their end goal is to unify Nordstar with Fluent UI. It will be one styling solution, one theming solution, one set of utilities, and one set of component patterns, one set of components itself, and one documentation site. Now, because of the distinction and the total different approach that both libraries took, it might take a while before this convergence happens. So like I said, this will happen iteratively. The next version of Fluent UI will be V8, and some of the concepts of Nordstar will already be integrated in Fluent UI, and some of the concepts will have to wait until version 9 or 10 or 11. There's no roadmap further than V8, so there's no timeline when both of these UX libraries will converge. So if you want to build a Teams tab inside Teams only, Nordstar is your way to go. Backend done, frontend done, and now there's authentication, of course. Because you take your application and you want to know who's logged in the application. Whether it's a bot, a messaging extension, or a Teams tab, it's mostly important that you know who will be interacting with the application, but also if you expose a third-party application inside Teams, you might need to use different authentication methods because that third-party application might not be connected to Azure Active Directory. Now, if you want to be connected to Azure Active Directory, you can use the newly released single sign-on features for tabs, which are currently actively being worked on for bots. So if your bot or your Teams tab is built on top of Azure Active Directory and just wants to use the currently logged in user for its interactions, you use the single sign-on feature. Like I said, it's G8 for tabs, but it's still in preview or worked on for bots. The way you implement this authentication scenarios are different for each of these extensibility points. So this means that you have to figure out how authentication works for bots, for messaging extensions, and for tabs. For tabs, it's been made easy. You have 5 or 7 lines of code that are made available by the team, and you make some changes in your app manifest. For bots, it's a bit more complex, and the same goes for messaging extensions, because they're built on the bot framework. So this means you have to figure out every scenario for your authentication, and authentication is notoriously hard in the Azure Active Directory space. Much improvements are made with the SDK releases of ADAL and MCell, but it's still rather complicated, and make sure that you take enough time in your development process to create a good authentication scenario. Also, when you're creating authentication scenario, make sure that you consider all user types. Your organizational users, which are your internal users, but also guest users. You might have invited through Azure AD B2B some users in your tenant. You have to decide whether or not they can interact with your application. And if they can interact, what is their experience? So you have to figure out a way to make sure that your application works for organizational users as well as guest users. If you don't support guest users, it's also fine, but at least make sure that your application then displays a nice message saying you don't support the guest users, instead of just erroring out with a big exception stack. And now with the meeting extensibility points, there's also the possibility that you've got anonymous meeting participants. So people that just call in but aren't authenticated in Teams, they aren't internal users, they aren't Azure AD B2B guest users in your tenant, they're just calling in because they received the meeting invitation. Now, if your application in a meeting depends on having a logged in user, then it will not work for the anonymous meeting participants. And you have to make sure that their experience is at least a little bit nice by showing a message that it's not supported by them to use it. Now, if you have or need to implement an authentication scenario in your application, try to use the tenant-specific login endpoint whenever possible. So it's the login.microsoft.com/tenant ID over the login.microsoft.com/common endpoint. This is especially important for guest users, because if you use the specific tenant ID endpoint, guest users will more easily get a token for that specific tenant. Because with the common endpoint, they might receive a wrong token. They might receive a token for their home tenant instead of your tenant in which they are the guest. So then your application receives a incorrect access token, and your user or your guest users cannot interact with your application. And provide a way to log out of your application. So if you don't interact or use SSO in your bots or in your tabs, you have to make sure that you provide a way not only to log in, but also to log out of your application. Very important here is don't use a global logout endpoint, which is login.microsoft.com/logout, because this will log out your users not just for your application, but for all of the workloads in Office 365. It will log them out of Teams, but also out of Word, Excel, and PowerPoint in the browser. It's just a global sign out in the browser. And that's probably not your intended way of, it's probably not your intention to log out the user everywhere when you only want to log them out of your application inside Teams. Number 8, determine device support. So when you go for device support, or go for creating an application inside Microsoft Teams, you have to determine what applications will be supported where. So which devices will your users use your application in, and you have to decide or make sure that you build your application and optimize your application for that usage. Will your application only be used by internal users that don't have a smartphone and they will always be using it on a desktop? Well, it's a fine use case, so you only have to optimize for that specific scenario. Now, if you want to support everything, you have to make sure that you at least test all of the devices or the most commonly used devices within your organization. Use some analytics to track which devices are used on Office 365 or to access Teams. These usage reports are already available in admin.microsoft.com, so you can check there what devices users are using and make sure that your application is tested on those devices and the operating systems on those devices. Also, when creating a Teams tab, for example, make sure that it's built with a responsive in a responsive way, so that when you open it on a smaller screen, for example on your iPad or on your iPhone or on a mobile device, that it resizes to the available screen estate and not just puts a lot of scroll bars on the screen, and that way create a very difficult experience for your end users. With a responsive design, you can also create a different design for each of the screen sizes. So you can rearrange buttons and UI components to make it feel easier for the end users to interact with your application. And when everything like this has been determined, you can start developing. When you start developing, you have to choose the development tools that simplify your development process. So when you look at the development process and a Teams application exists out of a manifest file, which is a big JSON file that describes all of the functionality that's been made available for your application or by your application in Teams, and where it can find the application backend. Is it hosted on AWS, on Azure, on your local web server? Where is your bot hosted? All of the interactions. Will it call out to graph and things like that? You have to define in the manifest file. Now, that manifest file is a very, very big JSON file, so you probably don't want to build this or configure this manually. Same goes for when you create a tab or a bot, you prefer that something scaffolds the default set of files that you need to create this functionality. Of course, you can create everything yourself, but why would you? If there are applications to improve or increase your efficiency, you can use them all. Looking at those applications that are available, or those that are possible to use, first of all, there's the Yeoman Generator for Teams. The Yeoman Generator for Teams is a community-driven project that was started by Victor Whelan a couple of years ago, and it's based on Yeoman, just like the SharePoint generator. So with Yeoman, you just type Yo Teams, and it guides you through a set of questions for all the functionalities that you want to build, and it scaffolds the project files that you need for all of those functionalities. The Yeoman generator, like I said, is community driven. It's available open source on GitHub, and you can provide your own bug fixes and pull requests there as well. The Yeoman generator for Teams exists for a couple of years already and is the most extended generator for Teams applications, because you can build almost all of the extensibility points with the Yeoman generator. It currently supports tabs and bots, outgoing webhooks, connectors, and messaging extensions. And I'm sure that very soon it will also support the meeting extensibility options. And it can be used to create localization for your application. So with localization, you generate source files for all the translations in your UI. So you can create a Teams application and say that it's supported in English, but also in Dutch and German and French, for example. And it will scaffold all the necessary files and functionalities in the app manifest so that your Teams application will run in the native language of the user. So when your user turns their Team client into French, that your application also loads the French files. And last but not least, there's validation. Now, validation is not directly supported within the Yeoman generator. Validation has to be done through the App Studio. So a combination of the Yeoman generator for Teams and App Studio will give you a full-blown development surface, and it covers everything. All of the extensibility points, but also the manifest editing, which is in the App Studio with a nice looking UI, so you don't have to fill in the JSON file, and a validation experience where you put your Teams app through the validation checklist, and Teams will, or the App Studio will tell you which changes you need to make before you can submit your application to, for example, your enterprise store, or maybe even to AppSource. The Yeoman generator for Teams generates their files based on Node.js and uses TypeScript. And by default, it also injects the Fluent UI library from NPM for your UI experience. More recently, Microsoft created the Microsoft Teams Toolkit for Visual Studio and for Visual Studio Code. Now, for Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code, they created that extensibility model or extensibility extension, and it supports in both places or in both IDEs. It supports creating tabs and bots and also messaging extensions, and it includes the validation capabilities that were firstly introduced in the App Studio. The differences between the Microsoft Teams Toolkit for Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code lie in the underlying technology. So where Visual Studio Code will scaffold the files based on Node.js, but it will create JavaScript files. It will also include the Fluent UI. When you go to Visual Studio, it will create everything based on .NET Core, so .NET Core, ASP.NET MVC. And it will create all the files in C#. Also there it will include the Stardust or Fluent UI North Star components for a native look and feel of your application. So you see here all of the toolkits available or the extensibility options in the IDEs available, but there are some major differences, especially in the extensibility points supported by all three of them, where Yeoman Generator, driven by the community, has the most options available, as well as localization, which is not included in the Microsoft Teams toolkit for either Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. So if you start with the Yeoman Generator for Teams, you'll have it all. So that's currently my recommendation. Especially also because the Teams toolkit for Visual Studio Code makes a very weird decision to generate all of the files in JavaScript instead of TypeScript. So the whole of Microsoft is moving into TypeScript files for an easier development experience, but the Teams toolkit generates your tab or bot in a JavaScript file. So that's quite confusing and not really in line with their global approach of pushing TypeScript more and more. So assuming that you chose the Yeoman Generator for Teams, you can start your development in Visual Studio Code because it just generates the project and the project files, and you open it in Visual Studio Code or any IDE in which you prefer to develop. You go through all of that development, you generate your application, you test drive it for yourself, maybe within your organization and or with a specific group of people. So it's time to choose your distribution method for that application. And there are a couple options. So when you take your application during development, you can sideload it. Sideloading basically is a way of loading your application just for you or for a specific team. So you go into Teams, into the Teams store, bottom left of your Teams client. You go in the Teams store and there's a upload a custom app option on the screen. Now if you click on it, it will ask you if you have permission to upload an application just for you or for your whole organization. The just for you is driven by a set of policies. So not everyone can sideload applications inside Microsoft Teams. Same goes for upload for your whole organization because that's driven by the fact that you're a Teams service administrator or a global administrator. You can also go into a specific team itself and upload a custom application in there. That's also sideloading, but for a specific team. Now, that's interesting during development or for testing purposes, so you can provide a new version of that application to a specific user for testing to make sure that the fixes that you've implemented actually fix their issue. But it's not very scalable if you want to distribute it to your 100 or 1000 people organization and you want to make it available for everyone in there. You cannot just go send the zip file to everyone and say, yeah, maybe just upload it yourself inside Microsoft Teams. So if you want that, there's the tenant app catalog. And the tenant app catalog has the goal of distributing the application in your organization. So this is a way of creating or publishing your application for your organization. In the Teams client, if they go into the App Store, there will be a build for your organization name option. And all of the custom applications that you've uploaded or your team's admin has uploaded will be shown in there. And when an application is distributed this way, it can also be used in the app permission policies and the app setup policies. First of all, uploading an application or distributing an application like this in your organization will require you to either be a Teams service administrator or a global administrator, and can be done from the Teams client itself. Like I said before, in the Teams App Store, upload a custom application and pick for your organization as an option, or go into the Teams Admin Center in the Manage Apps section, and there is an option to upload a new application. In both cases, a file browser will pop up allowing you to select the Teams app zip file and upload it into your organization. When it's in there, you can use the app permission policies to define who can use the application. So you can create a custom permission policy to say only this group of people can interact with these applications, including your custom one. And the same goes for app setup policies. And app setup policies are used to install applications for specific users when your application includes a personal scoped functionality. So you can say for this group of people, this application will automatically be installed. And you can also use app setup policies to pin an application to the left rail of a Teams client. So this allows for your custom application to be pinned directly with the Teams and the chat icons on the left rail of a Teams client. And in the near future, there will also be a way of installing from the Teams Admin Center an application inside a specific team. With app setup policies, you install an application for a specific user or a set of users. With the new functionality that will be available in the Manage Apps page inside the Teams Admin Center, you can deploy an application or install an application inside a specific team or a set of teams. And your custom application will also be supported for this way of distributing and adding it to a specific team. This is when you want to distribute your app only within your organization. Now, what if you aim big and you go for world domination? You want your application to be available everywhere. So that's when AppSource comes in. This is for distribution to the whole world. Your application can expand its app audience to 75 million Teams daily active users, and your customers can easily discover your application and install your application through the Teams App Store. Before you can get your application into AppSource, you have to go through a whole set of recommendations and checklists. So you have to go to an app submission checklist, make sure that your application fulfills all the requirements and the design guidelines. You have to run some validation tools on your application to make sure that your application has gone through the automated testing experience already and fulfills those requirements. And then you have to get publishing permissions in your partner center. So you have to be a partner of Microsoft and you have to get publishing permissions in the partner center. When you've got those permissions, you can go into Partner Center and upload your application in there for review. So you provide your application, a tenant with some test credentials and a testing scenario. So Microsoft will run through all of those scenarios, try it out, and check if your application fulfills all the requirements, and then they will publish your application into the AppSource. Their official recommendation is to give them at least 2 weeks for your submission to be reviewed and published. But the real world use cases suggest that it can take up to 3 months before you can actually see your application inside the Teams store, because they've got rigorous testing. They send you back with some feedback, things you need to change in your application. So it can take a long time before your application actually is published. So take that into account when you create deadlines on when your application needs to be globally available. So now that we've got the 10th stuff or the 10th thing out of the way, this wraps up my presentation. I still want to provide you with the resources. So the resources on how this or on which this session has been built. So you can read everything into more detail if you'd like. Um, and the only thing that rests me is to thank you for joining. If you've got questions, you can use the Q&A in this live event to ask them, and I'll try and answer them as good as possible. If you've got questions afterwards, feel free to reach out through Twitter or on my blog. You can find me on LinkedIn or on any other social media and just send all of the questions that way. I also always do a sticker giveaway with my most recent presentations. So go to the given URL, fill in the form, and you get a chance of winning a sticker package from Pimp Your Own Device from fellow MVPs Louise Freese and Elio Struijf. I will be giving you the two stickers that are on the screen, the one licensing guild or user adoption, and the I hate stickers sticker. And then you get the ability to pick two others from the store as well, and Pimp Your Own Device will send them your way. So thank you very much for attending my session, and I hope you enjoyed it and enjoy the rest of this Collab Days Barcelona event.